Hello, and welcome back. I'm so glad to have all of you with us again for another session of On Book, the Old Globe Shakespeare Reading Group. On behalf of the staff, board, and artists, I want to welcome you to our conversation today. This week, we are actually bringing to a close our conversation of the Taming of the Shrew through these next two sessions. Up till now, we've talked about the play in a more general sense. We've talked a lot about theme. We've talked a lot about character. And this week, I wanted to sort of pivot just a little bit and talk a little bit about some close reads of the text. If you join us again on Thursday at the same time, we're going to talk to Ursula Meyer. She is a voice and speech coach. She's the person who's slated to work on this show this summer. So we're going to take some time with her to read closely another section of the text. But today, I'm delighted to have back with us Director Shauna Cooper. I'm going to bring Shauna on. Yay! Hi! Welcome back. I feel like this is the perfect bookend to our conversation about the play. You kind of came and joined us at the beginning of our conversation. Yeah. You're going to come back and join us at the close of our conversation. So today with Shauna, we're going to talk about the play's big final speech. I mean, it's not the last lines of the play, but it is the final moment, I would say, big moment of the play. And so if you guys want to pull out your texts, we are in Act 5, Scene 2. And I have some text here we can put on the screen, and then we can also refer to it specifically. So as we get started, I want to ask you, Shauna, this big speech that Kate gives to the assembled multitudes in this Act 5, Scene 2, is this kind of at the heart of some of the controversy of the play? I mean, is this a speech that actors question or that audiences question? Or what about this particular speech makes it significant?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like whenever you're working on this play, this has certainly been true for me. People's first question is usually, "What are you going to do about her big speech at the end?" And it's a problem, that you have to solve. And even if they can get on board the rest of the play, there is a question, I think, for modern audiences of how you make sense of this final speech. And I think whatever you choose to do with it, certainly as a director and actor, speaks volumes about your point of view about the play as a whole and what your interpretation of the play is. It all comes down to this moment. It's game time. I think the audience kind of comes wondering, if they know the play at all, what direction you're going to go and where you're going to land the dismount, so to speak. So yeah, it's some pressure
landing, here with this last speech.
Yeah. And I feel like there are a few things in play with this text. I think one, there is the danger, and we all talk about it as like her final big speech, but I would argue, did I just freeze there for a sec?
Yeah, you're good though. You didn't cut out.
Good. I think remembering that she doesn't know where she's headed, and in an ideal world, I think the more spontaneity of thought there is from the moment Petruchio, throughout the play as a whole, but that when he asks this question or really makes this demand, tell these headstrong women what they do owe their lords and husbands, even him saying that is not a premeditated thought, right? Like that comes spelling out. And then I think the question that hangs in the balance for her and for him is, is she going to answer it? How is she going to answer it? And I think neither of them knowing what she's going to say until she says it, and then where each thought unravels to and how and why, actually is the thing that can get you, I think, to a deeper place with the text. And remembering that it's not all one thing. I think there's a temptation with this to make it all one idea, and it's just not. And I think the discoveries that she goes on throughout the course of the text in front of a group of people is part of what lands her where she lands at the end of the text. And that was the breakthrough I had. It wasn't until I really started to understand how or why one thought could lead to the next that I understood what it was about, as what the journey was actually about, probably of the whole play, quite frankly.
Well, maybe you can give us some context. Remind us where we are. What's the context of the speech? What's the context of the scene? And then where this speech, as we begin looking at it, where it specifically comes from.
Yes. Okay. So we're in Act 5, Scene 2. It's the last scene of the play. Bianca's just had this like whirlwind elopement, really, like not even wedding. And then they've like thrown together this like after party. It's not, it's like was meant to be her dream wedding, but I think it all unravels in such a way that everyone, all the dads are pissed at their kids. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of conflict. People in my book are probably having one too many drinks, as you tend to at a wedding. And Bianca has certainly, just based on the text, started to unravel a bit. Like she is suddenly bawdier and throwing insults and in a way that she never has before in the play, at least on text. So you're starting to see other sides of people, and Kate and the widow almost get into like a full-blown fight right before this, which is actually one of the moments that happens. Oh no! At the top of the scene, I think there's an argument just about character that happens, and the widow insults Kate, and she calls her out, and it's a messy end of night, wild kind of wedding party.
Okay.
And that's the preamble, and then the women have left the room. And the men remain, and they end up getting into this betting match, and they bet on who, if each husband calls to their wife, and the wives being Bianca, the widow, and Kate, who will actually come. And so they bet on this, and Petruchio kind of bets everything, and I believe sort of bets his heart in a way that like the decision that the two of them have come to during the sun and the moon scene, where they've kind of agreed to play the game of life together, that she will honor that, and that she will come when he calls her, even if he does it in this kind of abhorrent manner. But I think he's taken a bet on that, and he doesn't know himself what's going to happen. So I think it's as much of a surprise to him as to everyone else when Kate is actually the only woman who shows.
One of the things that we talked a little bit about with John O. Roberts, who had played Petruchio here at the Globe in the past, was his relationship with these other men. And I'm wondering if there's something at stake in that moment for him as he's setting this thing up, in terms of how he's seen by the other men, what his role is in this world, this man world that they're in before getting called women.
I mean, I think this play is as much a growing up and coming of age and growing into what kind of man he's going to be for Petruchio as it is for Kate kind of growing into the woman that she's going to be. I think this scene, I would argue, is a bit of a regression for Petruchio. I think he kind of falls prey to the machismo. I don't know what Jono said, but I sort of feel like he falls prey to this like one-upmanship of, who's most in control of their wives. And I think he kind of falls back into that Padua way of like the men are in charge, the men are who's boss, and that there's a kind of there's a constant competition, and only one man can win and be the biggest man. And Petruchio goes for this, I think in part feeling honestly like he does finally have a partner in Kate, but I think he gets caught up in the game, which is part of what she starts to recognize when she's come back in. And I think in a way acknowledges that, but I would argue through the course of her text shifts us from game mode to like life mode, and has some kind of deep revelations and admissions and kind of discoveries of what marriage and partnership actually mean. And she does it all out loud in front of a big group of people, which is quite vulnerable, I would say.
One of the things that we also, I think, mentioned about the setup of the speech is that she sort of has the floor here in a way that she might not have had the floor in front of this group of people before, that they actually listened to her for quite some time in a way that perhaps she hasn't taken the advantage of, or she hasn't been allowed this sort of speeching moment, this moment to be listened to.
Yeah. And I think,
or do you take it in a slightly different way?
Well, I think she's offered the floor by Petruchio, right? But she's offered it in this kind of problematic way. She chooses to take the floor, I would say then. But then I think by doing that, and over a series of initial kind of statements that then lead to revelations, she claims the floor. And I think really people start to listen because she is saying things that no one in this world have really ever heard articulated by anyone, let alone her.
Great. Was there anything else you want to do to set up the speech, or do you want to look at the top of it?
Well, I think the really interesting thing, and then let's bring the text up, is to think specifically about who she's talking to, right? Because there are so many people there in this moment, just to remember who they are. I mean, Petruchio has asked her the question, tell these headstrong women. There are the headstrong women who are the widow, and Bianca is who he's referring to in that moment. Her father's there. What Bianca is her sister, who's just gotten married. There are her former suitors who rejected her, or not even former suitors, Bianca's former suitors, people who her father wanted to be her former suitors, and they've rejected her, called her names, shamed her. They're all at that table. And so I think one of the interesting things, and maybe a good way into it, is to just, as we read line by line initially, just think about, riff a little bit on this question of who is she talking to? And also perhaps the other thing is, does she mean what she says? Which I think also can change, right? There's an approach to this speech sometimes where it's all a joke, or it's kind of tongue in cheek, or it's sarcastic, or, so does she mean what she is saying or not? And who is she talking to? Maybe two beginning questions.
Great. Okay. I'm going to put this.
All right. So let's bring it up.
We'll take a look at it. I'm going to hide myself, and then we can take a look at the text.
And so what I might do, is it helpful? I guess maybe I'll just read a couple lines and then propose some thoughts. And certainly I will just say, as we're reading and talking, if we were all in the room together, I feel like I would just be posing these things as questions. Who is she talking to at the beginning of this text? So if as we're reading, people have thoughts about who is she saying this line to? How might that change the meaning? And does she mean what she's saying right now or not? Feel free to just type in, or if you have other questions.
Yes, please. I would encourage you. We can see your comments and we will bring them up onto the screen.
Yeah, great. So I think it's another good thing to say. There's some pushback to this idea of Catherine tell these women what they do owe their lords and husbands. And the widow specifically says, no way. And Petruchio repeats the ask. He doubles down, which also is interesting because it means that Kate doesn't answer right away. And Petruchio says, I say she shall, and first begin with her, meaning the widow. So I think the first question is, does Kate, in fact, follow that order? Does she begin with the widow, or does she begin with someone else? What she says is, fie, fie, unknit that threatening, unkind brow, and dart not scornful glances from those eyes to wound thy lord, thy king, thy governor. So she does, in fact, do the thing he just said, right? Which is to, in a way, charge these headstrong women what duty they do owe. She's saying part of what duty you owe is don't make faces and mean looks to wound thy lord. And then lord is not enough, king, governor. So there's a bit of kind of extrapolation on this idea of husband. And I think because of that, you could make the argument that she's playing the game a little bit. Maybe it's a little sarcastic, whatever. And you could make the argument that she's talking to the widow as he's asked her to. she could also just be shooting it right back at Petruchio with a little, bite and a little, extra sauce behind it. So then she goes on to say, new thought, new sentence. It blots thy beauty as frost do bite the meads, confounds thy fame, meaning tarnishes your reputation, as whirlwinds shake fair buds, and in no sense is meet or amiable. It's just not a nice thing to do. So one thing that I find interesting is that she moves on. The next thing she says is that it stains your beauty, right? Which is something that she has been told since the beginning of the play. So I read that as her saying that to give mean looks, dart scornful glances, all these things, this is how society interprets that act. And another way to think about that, in my view, is fact, right? This is the fact of how these actions are interpreted.
Is that then you're saying a little bit of like turning the tables? Like, didn't you always tell me not to do this? Is that sort of, and now you're...
I think this is, again, it depends on who she's talking to and does she mean what she says. So sure, if she's throwing it back in the faces of her suitors, she could be mocking them a little bit. I think if she's talking to it blots thy beauty, it could be the widow, and it could just be, you and I both know that this is the way that the world interprets women who push back against their husbands. Fact. Yeah. There's power, I think, in simple facts. And then confounds thy fame, it spoils your reputation. And I think remembering how personal that idea for Kate is, right? Like her entire life has been just kind of on a stranglehold because of the reputation she has had of being a shrew, of being a difficult woman, how that has caused her pain and limited her life choices. That is a fact. And there is a cost to that fact, I would argue. And so what is it to say to her sister, right? Her little sister, this is just the truth of the world we live in, right? And what is the cost of that, right?
Interesting.
One possibility, many different possibilities, but that could be one possibility. A woman moved is like a fountain troubled. So a woman kind of angry, moved, and probably passionate is like a fountain of water troubled, muddy, ill-seeming, thick, bereft of beauty. And while it is so, none so dry or thirsty will deign to sip or touch one drop of it. So that's been her story. I mean, in that 4-line sentence, she really describes what her experience in the world has been. And so I think there's great value in just her personalizing this, like acknowledging how for herself and for the room, how they've all thought about her. If you want to get really personal, what is it to look at your dad, who has both had to struggle with this fact of you and has also in some ways not known what to do about this truth about you, and say a woman moved is like a fountain troubled, muddy, ill-seeming, thick, bereft of beauty, that I both know this is how you've seen me or how the world has seen me. And just like the complexity of that relationship within those 2 lines. And what is it to look at the very men who have been the men who wouldn't touch you when you were that, right? To look at Gremio, to look at Hortensio. And you can name it, you could call them out. You could, again, just the power of the fact of it. You know, these were the facts that we all lived through. While this, so none so dry or thirsty will deign to sip or touch one drop of it. And I think the fact of that can lead her to the realization of the one person who that wasn't true about, right? Who was the one person when she was what this world deemed angry or erratic or crazy, would deign to touch or sip one drop of it, is Petruchio.
Mm-hmm.
And that can bring her back to him for thy husband is thy Lord, thy life, thy keeper, thy head, thy sovereign. She sort of, kind of goes to these sort of more playful places again. One that cares for thee. Comes back to that simple, powerful idea, one that cares for thee. And I think what is really interesting about those two lines is, one, thy husband is thy Lord. That is stressed when you scan it. And to me, that speaks to a kind of realization, a change in opinion, a change of point of view for her. And also she's taking the kind of wordplay she did earlier at the top of the speech with to wound thy lord, thy king, thy governor. She's still using that rhetoric, but instead she's saying thy Lord, thy life, thy keeper, which I hear as someone, a protector and a caretaker.
Do you think that when people have questions or issues with this speech, that they are hearing it reiterating as should be some of these patriarchal structures? Like, instead of just simply saying, thy husband is thy Lord as a reflection of a fact of a time period, is there a concern that saying it is, we're reinforcing it, or saying is as should be? Or I believe in this structure, or this is the way that I think the world should work. Do you know what I'm asking about?
I do. I mean, I think part of the question is, how do you interpret Lord?
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to say, yes, if you're interpreting Lord as master, then, and in the rhetoric of the previous line, to wound thy Lord, thy king, thy governor, it seems like she is interpreting Lord as master, because how she builds on that idea is to king, which is about power, as is governor, all about power. But the second time she comes back to it, she says, thy husband is thy Lord, thy life, thy keeper. Those are very different ideas. And she does say thy head, thy sovereign, which is why to me it feels like it gets a little sarcastic for a moment. But what she ends that thought with, the end of that line, is one that cares for thee. So there's an idea of caretaking in partnership that she's introducing, this idea of, and so Lord can also be husband, right? It can also be one who takes care of you, who keeps you safe, who, right? There's all different ways of interpreting that. And so I think it depends on that, right? It depends on your point of view on the word Lord. And the great thing about Shakespeare is, as an actor, you can invest. I had this Shakespeare teacher who would talk about chicken Kiev. You know how you stuff chicken Kiev with like spinach or something? It's like chicken stuffed with like spinach and cheese or something. So he would like chicken Kiev that word with the meaning you want it to have. So it's like, if you're chicken Kieving Lord with like master, that has a very different point of view than if you're chicken Kieving Lord with lover, with caretaker, with even keeper. I think safe keeper, right? That there is, anyway, I think it depends on that's part of why I say like point of view is so important. Line by line, who he's talking to, line by line.
I'm pulling up here a question from the group. It says, the first half of the speech could have been addressed sincerely to Kate herself earlier in the play. If she is speaking from the heart, she seems to condemn her own moved past behavior. Is she telling the widow, I have changed, you'd better change too?
Well, again, I think it's the question of, do you think she's condemning? Like, it's different to say, you could say, it blots thy beauty as frost do bite the meads, talking about scornful looks, and being moved, as the question suggested, confounds thy fame as whirlwind shake fair buds. You could say that and be condemning the person you're talking to, past self, widow, Bianca. Or you could be saying those things. That's part of why I talk about the powerful fact of those things, because I would agree that to be a passionate, strong-willed woman in the world, it affects how people see you. It affects what they think you look like. It affects your reputation. There is a cost to it. I'm someone who has lived that cost, and to admit, to sort of name the truth of the world we live in, the fact of it, even if I don't like it, I don't like it. I don't think that should be true. But the fact is, I think the world still thinks that way, and I have paid that cost, right? And I think Kate is in a similar situation that, you could say she's condemning that idea, but I think there's almost more power and vulnerability in having the courage to state
to name
the reality of the world you live in and what that has cost you, and just have the courage to live in the challenging, vulnerable fact of that. And like, what do we do about that?
Great. I don't want to stop you from going forward, please.
All right. So when it cares for thee, let's imagine she's still talking to Petruchio. And for thy maintenance, which is like caretaking, commits his body to painful labor, both by sea and land, to watch the night in storms, the day in cold, while thou liest warm at home, secure and safe. And craves. I'll stop there for a second, because I think that is a tricky line. I feel like she means most of what she says, but there's a few moments, and that's one of them, where I feel like it's hard to set up that dichotomy and not, if you don't come at it from a kind of playing a game, giving him a hard time sort of place, or like pretending, playing the game of what society thinks is the good wife. It's hard to find a feminist lens to come at that line through, I will admit. I think I cut it. I think that's one of the few lines I cut. But what I keep actually,
and what was the portion? What would be the portion of it that you cut?
I think I kept actually commits his body to painful labor, both by sea and land, to watch the night in storms, the day in cold, because I think that can all be code for what they've been through together, and her acknowledging, like, I see you. I saw the way, like, you stayed up all night. Like, you didn't let me sleep, but you didn't sleep either. Like, you trucked through the woods, and we both got covered in mud. And like, I gave you hell. You deserved it, but I gave you hell, and you took it, and you figured out a way to like keep moving forward and fighting for us. Is like, that could be code for that, I guess. So there's
a comment on the stream here. Somebody saying, I think she's yanking Petruchio's chain. It's not like he's a laborer.
For sure. I think if you had a Petruchio that seemed very clearly like more upper class, you could totally have her just like yanking her chain. I think his chain, I think that would also be great. It's just like, depending on who your Petruchio is and how clear it is that he is like so not a laborer. But you can easily say commits his body to painful labor, both by sea and land, to watch the night in storms, the day in cold, and craves no other tribute at thy hands. I think I just cut that one line. But I think you could also, to that comment, say, well, thou liest warm at home, secure and safe. We all know that isn't true, sort of have that little tweak on it. And craves no other tribute at thy hands but love, fair looks, and true obedience. So the love and fair looks, I think there can be a recognition from her of like, I haven't been willing to give you that. Like, I see you and what you have been asking for, and just realization that that's what it is. And then I think true obedience is her calling him out on, because true is stressed, and saying it's not like ultimate obedience or pure obedience or like complicated or like absolute obedience. It's true obedience, which I think is an important qualifier. But then she says, too little payment for so great a debt. And in my book, is most powerful if she really means that. If she really realizes that, like, what he's asking for in return in terms of love and fair looks sometimes, you know, like maybe once in a while, and, you know, is like not a lot given what it means to have someone fight for you the way that he's been willing to fight for her. Mm-hmm. If you've told that story up until that point.
Yes.
My son thinks she's letting Petruchio know what he's signed up for. I love that.
We'll put that comment on.
That's good. That's so awesome. Okay, so then this is where it gets tricky to me in terms of the feminist lens question. So as written, she doubles down. She just like goes all the way. Such duty as the subject owes the prince, even such a woman oweth to her husband. And when she is froward, peevish, sullen, sour, and not obedient to his honest will, again, qualifier of honest, what is she but a foul, contending rebel, and graceless, which is ungrateful, traitor to her loving lord? So that gets tricky for me. That's sort of where, to me, it feels like it gets out of balance. Like up until then, I can start to get behind her sort of saying, this is what I feel I owe my husband. Like I'm saying woman because I am a woman saying these things, but ultimately these are what we owe each other as partners. But she just goes like so deep into the women language and the kind of submissive language there that it gets tricky. So here's my solve. So this is where I do a little rewriting.
All right, now let me put this back up so we can see.
Yeah, it's not a lot of rewriting. It's like a few pronouns swapped. Again, with the idea that ultimately what she's saying is about both people in a partnership, not only the woman. So she said, too little, and craves no other tribute at thy hands but love, fair looks, and true obedience. Too little payment for so great a debt. Such duty as a subject owes the prince, even such a woman oweth to her husband. So continuing that argument. But when he is froward, peevish, sullen, sour, and not obedient to her honest will, what is he but a foul, contending rebel and graceless traitor to her loving lord, to his loving lord? I think his loving lord. You can keep lord. I feel. Like change the pronoun.
What's behind the pronoun shift that you made there in this version of the text?
So for me, that's about the same rules apply, vice versa, right? If he is froward, peevish, sullen, sour, and not obedient to her honest will, just like she needs to be obedient to his honest will, then what is he but a foul, contending rebel to her honest, right? To her honest will, and a traitor actually to, in this case, his wife. So I think it just allows you to make that idea of true, deep, complete loyalty, I guess, in a way, loyalty to a two-way street. And then to me, it's about more like what it is to abandon yourself fully to each other rather than a purely one-sided ask. And then the last change I make is in this next line, which as written is, I am ashamed that women are so simple to offer war where they should kneel for peace or seek for rule, supremacy, and sway. Well, I'll just do those two lines for a second. So I think this is one of the lines that people have the most trouble with in the speech. I'm ashamed that women are so simple. But the truth is, if you look at the whole thought, I am ashamed that women are so simple to offer war when they should kneel for peace. In theory, I actually agree with that idea in terms of like the value system of war versus peace. the idea that it's exclusively a woman's job to do that, which can be kind of suggested in that, is troublesome, right? But if you simply say, I am ashamed that people are so simple to offer war where they should kneel for peace, I think we can all get behind that idea in a relationship, that if like what is being asked for is like finding your way towards peace with each other rather than warring it out. And granted, fighting is sometimes really important, I also believe. But if it's about people, not women, then suddenly it's an idea that you can kind of get behind, right? I am ashamed that people are so simple. Realization for her to offer war where they should kneel for peace or seek for rule, supremacy, and sway. Do any of us think that that's what you should be seeking for in a relationship, rule, supremacy, and sway, when they are bound to serve, love, and obey? Obey, a little tricky, right? Still maybe even a little tricky for contemporary audiences if it's about both people. But this idea of serve and love, I don't know. I mean, I feel like that is part of what you want to offer and hopefully receive in a relationship.
I'll pull up another here comment.
Yeah.
Here. This is along the lines of what you're saying. Since the general Shakespeare trope is for the comedies to end with marriage, is there any way in which this speech is more her vows, regardless of the fact that her wedding was technically earlier on? And I think that gets to what you're saying a little bit, that, you know, there's a sense of making a promise in a relationship, or saying what are the terms of this relationship going to be, and what are we going to do for each other, in the way, both in the speech and then in the tweaks that you've made for production.
Yeah, and I think part of the thrilling thing about it for the people at the wedding and the people in our audience is that she's discovering and kind of making these vows spontaneously as she goes, that she's starting to realize that she believes them, right? And that they are important and of value, and like that so yeah, I think absolutely vows, and spontaneous ones that she's crafting in the moment. I think that's part of why he is silent and kind of, for the first time in the play, really, because it just sort of takes his breath away.
As a director, I mean, it's an interesting question that you bring up. I'm going to head this text here for a second. And that you're obviously not only working with Kate to craft her reaction, but her creation of the speech, but you're working with the other actors on stage to craft their reactions to the speech, which I think is a big part of how we as an audience are able to hear it. As we watch Petruchio and these other people, are they angry? Are they amused? Are they rolling their eyes? Are they surprised? You know, so there's a wide range of reactions that the gathered many that she's speaking to can and probably do have throughout the course of the speech.
That's exactly right. Point of view, both for her, but as much in the listening. And I would argue exactly as you just described, active point of view and even audible point of view sometimes. Like, I think there's opportunity for Hortensio and or Gremio to just, like, what is laughter? What is derision in the face of certain ideas? Like, how does that actually, there's great value, I think, sometimes in, you know, you can imagine if she's kind of being sarcastic and saying, you know, dart not scornful glances from those eyes to wound thy lord, thy king, thy governor. And Hortensio's over there going, yeah, you know, just kind of celebrates that there's a way in which by leaning into the misogyny of it, you start to undercut it and make fun of it. And then what is it for him to then be on the spot with, you know, and while it is so, none so dry or thirsty will deign to sip or touch one drop of it, and be faced with her authenticity and vulnerability. And like, not just throw a joke back at him as she's done the entire play, but just let him know what that has cost her.
Yeah. And then the interaction with her audience, allowing her to have discoveries in the speech continue growing from that, as opposed to just growing from inside her own head.
Totally. And what is it for Bianca to see her older sister suddenly like articulate love and partnership in this way and be standing next to a man that she's starting to realize she doesn't even really know, you know, and just what is the kind of cost of that, to be learning these things suddenly, but maybe too late. And, you know, I think the listening, and what is it for Baptista, you know, to sort of see her go on this kind of deep journey that she goes on over the course of this, her father, you know, to witness her going on that journey. What is it for Petruchio to have her take these ideas so much further and deeper than he ever anticipated that she could or would?
Taking just here another comment from the chat, it would seem that Shauna's pronoun changes in those two lines allow women not to have to be the sole guardians of virtue. The onus now lands on both men and women, which I think is a really lovely observation.
I love that. Yeah.
Right. I know we're running a little long here on our time, Shauna. I'm sorry about that, but I want to let you get to hear this end of this speech here. I don't want to cheat ourselves out of the end of the speech.
Okay, I'll go fast. No, I'm just gonna. I'll do the
I know I don't want to take. I know we've run long on you for asking for your time as well.
Oh no, that's I lose all track of time when I'm working on these texts. They're so inspiring. Okay, but we'll go fast. I think the big thing to just keep in mind at this point is like how, as she starts to unlock these revelations, how the way in which this becomes a kind of almost spiritual awakening for her. So the tumble in a way of these ideas, one on top of another, I think is actually a key part of it. Why are our bodies soft and weak and smooth, unapt to toil and trouble in the world? I think that's another one I cut. So it's just, why are our bodies soft and weak and smooth, but that our soft conditions and our hearts should well agree with our external parts. So I think, again, just making an argument for like the fact that our hearts are in fact a kind of thing that we could be wearing on the outside, and that our just like our skin and our kind of if you were to compare us to like rugged animals or whatever, that there is something more emotional about us, there is something more kind of vulnerable to the world and elements about us, and that be actually being most true to ourselves in some way. Come, you froward and unable worms. I think, she circles back around, I think, to the women. My mind hath been as big as one of yours, my heart as great, my reason happily more, to bandy word for word and frown for frown. But now I see our lances, which are our swords, are but straws. And actually, I would say, come, you froward and unable worms is all of us. Probably, like not just everyone at the table, but it's the moment at which she's talking to us as the audience as well, and saying, you've seen it. You've seen the reasons why I had to, bandy word for word and frown for frown. But now I see, and I think that see is so critical. I see in this moment right now, that's part of the awakening I'm talking about, like the nowness of that our swords are swords that we fight with and we destroy each other with and we attack each other with. They're simply straws. Our strength as weak, our weakness past compare, that seeming to be most, which we indeed least are. Okay, this was crazy. I looked up the word weak at one point because it was both the actress and I were struggling with it on the last production. And one of the definitions of weak is actually flexible to bending. And something like that. And I thought that was so fascinating because we have retermed this idea of weak as being a strictly feminine thing and an inherently like negative thing. It's like the etymology of it is totally fascinating. But if you actually think about the idea of weak as flexible or bending, that's quite a good thing. Like to be flexible or bending in a relationship can be really important if you have two strong-willed people who need to figure out how to join a union, which are what Kate and Petruchio are. Then veil your stomachs, which is suppress your pride, for it is no boot, it's pointless. And place your hand below your husband's foot, which I would argue is maybe just like saying. She doesn't maybe even actually mean it in that moment. But then in token of which duty, so in sign of which duty, you know what, I'm not just going to say it. I'm not going to just talk the talk and walk the walk. If he please, and she does the most vulnerable thing of the entire play, right? If my hand is ready, may it do him ease. And she offers that hand. And then I think how or where he receives that gesture is also critical, right? To telling a story of equity and partnership, if that is the story you want to tell.
Is this something that was like a common saying, or this sort of hand under the foot? I'm curious if this is something that has some history attached to it, other than in this play, which is sort of where I think most people might have heard it or seen it in the past.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It may, you know what? Leave something for next time. Ask that question to Ursula. I feel like she would probably know. Yeah. And then let me know, because I feel like I should know the answer to that question.
Well, great. We'll talk about that at the top of rehearsals. So as you're coming out of this speech, in moving forward in these last few moments of the play, because there are maybe only 10, 15 lines, yes, that follow the speech. Where do you feel as a director, or as someone who's crafting a story and using this speech to tell a particular story with the play, where do you feel it's leaving Kate and Petruchio and Bianca and the widow and Hortensio and all of these characters at the end of the play? Where would you say the speech leaves them and us as audience members here as we conclude the play?
I mean, in my dream world, I feel like what happens is we see this woman have, as I kind of articulated, a spiritual awakening about the power of vulnerability and fully abandoning yourself to another human being, and sort of making those vows and promises, as a couple of the comments suggested, to her partner in front of this group of people, that he is almost speechless by that, and hopefully, I think, moved to tears, and that we see them come together in an embrace, in like joint vulnerability, actually, that for him being silent and listening in the deep way he just has is equally vulnerable. And we see them like come together actually completely, fully for the first time. Like, that we've seen them kiss earlier, they have to, based on the text, and you're seeing them starting to like feel each other and like have fun together and like do a lot of, but you haven't seen them. There's a union. There is a kind of completion and kind of maybe like end of their wedding, in a way that they come together in a deep, vulnerable, powerful, deeply loving way, that everyone else is like blindsided. I think wrestling with this or rejecting it or whatever in their own different ways, that Kate and Petruchio actually just like walk off together into the sunset of a kind of sort, into starting their own new lives together. And we feel like, oh, they just might make it. Like, actually, we're rooting for them to figure out a way to build a relationship on a kind of new set of values together. And then everyone else is left behind, kind of tumbling in the awakening that they have just witnessed and had to hear, and reckoning with what it now means with their own relationships, which have valued money and kind of superficial beauty and status and power. And I think they're just like at that messy wedding table at the end of the Fellini film, reckoning with their wrecked lives, trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do about it.
Now they have
leaving us to kind of reckon with what choices are we making in our own relationships, and are those the choices that we want to be making, and hopefully go out of the theater talking about it.
I think that it seems to be a kind of common theme as we've talked about the play with different people, that the play is functioning best when we have these two characters who are able to make their own world within the larger world, outside the larger world, reject the larger world in some way, to have their own truth, their own unity, their own vows, their own decisions about what a relationship between a man and a woman is going to be. And then they kind of leave everyone else in the mess of what the world is.
That's exactly right. That's beautifully said.
Is that where I want to live, or now do I have to make some changes in my own relationships? Yeah. Can I?
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah.
Well, that's really super exciting. I love looking at that speech in incredible detail. I haven't seen another question hop up here on the chat, so perhaps that's a good place to come.
Yes, I should run as well. But this was so great. It's fun, and I just hope I get to see you all later in the summer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, all of you for joining us. I hope you'll come back again on Thursday, and we'll talk about a little bit more pieces of the text in detail, and perhaps a piece of Henry V as we switch to reading that show.
Ooh,
so thank you, Anna, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, take care.
Bye.